The morning mist clung to the Charles River like a shroud as George Washington gazed across the water toward Boston, where British cannon bristled from every fortification. It was July 3rd, 1775, and the 43-year-old Virginian had just assumed command of a ragtag Continental Army that bore little resemblance to the disciplined forces he had hoped to lead. The acrid smell of gunpowder still lingered in the air from the recent carnage at Bunker Hill, where colonial militia had proven they could bleed the British red, even in defeat. Washington's weathered hands gripped the reins of his horse as he surveyed the siege lines that stretched in a rough semicircle around Boston. What he saw troubled him deeply. Men lounged about their positions without proper uniforms, some barely clothed at all. Officers mingled freely with enlisted men. Discipline was practically non-existent, and the fortifications looked more like children's sandcastles than military earthworks. Yet these same men had managed to trap Lieutenant General Thomas Gage and nearly 9,000 British regulars inside Boston like rats in a barrel. The new commander-in-chief had arrived at Cambridge just 2 days earlier, accompanied by his military secretary Joseph Reed and a small retinue of Virginia officers. The Continental Congress had placed enormous faith in Washington's shoulders, naming him to lead an army that existed more in theory than reality. As he rode through the camps, he could hear the murmur of conversations dying away as men recognized the tall figure on horseback. Some removed their hats respectfully, while others simply stared with curious eyes at the man who would either lead them to independence or to the gallows. According to historical accounts from the Massachusetts Historical Society, Washington's first impressions of his new command were far from encouraging. The Continental Army consisted of approximately 14,000 men, scattered across multiple camps, but determining exact numbers proved nearly impossible due to poor record-keeping. New England militia units came and went as they pleased, with many considering their service complete after the fighting at Lexington, Concord, and Bunker Hill. The concept of long-term enlistment was foreign to men accustomed to serving for specific campaigns or local emergencies. Dr. Joseph Warren, the charismatic leader who had been killed at Bunker Hill just weeks earlier, had left behind a power vacuum that various colonial commanders struggled to fill. Artemus Ward, the nominal leader before Washington's arrival, had done his best to maintain some semblance of order, but the Massachusetts general lacked the authority and experience necessary to forge a unified fighting force. Israel Putnam, the grizzled veteran known as Old Put, commanded respect among the Connecticut troops but was viewed with suspicion by Massachusetts men, who jealously guarded their local prerogatives. As Washington established his headquarters in the vassal house in Cambridge, he began to grasp the magnitude of his task. The British controlled Boston Harbor with their powerful navy, ensuring a steady supply line for General Gage's forces. Meanwhile, the Continental Army survived on whatever provisions could be scraped together from the surrounding countryside. Gunpowder was so scarce that Washington discovered his army possessed less than 30 rounds per man, a situation that would have been laughable if it weren't so dangerous. The irony was not lost on him that his men had managed to maintain a siege while possessing barely enough ammunition for a single engagement. The morning of July 4th, 1775, brought no celebration, only the harsh reality of command as Washington began his first full day leading the Continental Army. The challenges seemed to multiply with each passing hour, as reports flooded in from subordinate commanders, detailing shortages of everything from blankets to basic medical supplies. The army that had spontaneously assembled after Lexington and Concord was rapidly discovering that enthusiasm alone could not sustain a prolonged military campaign against the world's most powerful empire. Washington's first order of business was to establish some semblance of military discipline among troops who viewed the entire concept with deep suspicion. New England militia prided themselves on their democratic traditions and egalitarian spirit, concepts that clashed directly with the hierarchical structure necessary for military effectiveness. Officers elected by their men often lacked both the authority and inclination to enforce unpopular orders, while enlisted soldiers felt free to voice their opinions on strategy and tactics, as if they were attending a town meeting rather than serving in an army. The Virginian commander faced a delicate balancing act between imposing necessary discipline and maintaining the fragile unity that held his diverse force together. Connecticut men regarded Massachusetts soldiers with barely concealed contempt, viewing them as arrogant and unreliable. Rhode Island troops complained bitterly about food distribution and sleeping arrangements, while New Hampshire militia threatened to march home if their grievances weren't addressed immediately. Each colony's contingent brought its own customs, drill procedures, and concepts of military service, creating a Tower of Babel effect that frustrated every attempt at standardization. General Charles Lee, the eccentric English-born officer who had thrown his lot in with the colonial cause, proved to be both an asset and a source of additional complications. Lee's military experience in European conflicts was invaluable, but his abrasive personality and tendency to criticize everything and everyone made him difficult to work with. His constant complaints about American military incompetence, delivered in a harsh British accent, did nothing to endear him to troops already suspicious of foreign influence in their ranks. Nathanael Greene, the young Rhode Island Quaker who had abandoned his pacifist beliefs to take up arms, emerged as one of Washington's most reliable subordinates during these early weeks. Despite his lack of formal military training, Greene possessed an intuitive understanding of both strategy and human nature that impressed his commander. His ability to maintain discipline among Rhode Island troops, while still respecting their democratic sensibilities, provided a model that Washington hoped to replicate throughout the Army. The shortage of qualified officers created additional headaches for the new commander-in-chief. Many positions remained unfilled simply because no suitable candidates could be found among the ranks. Those who did serve often lacked the education and experience necessary to handle complex military logistics, leading to confusion and inefficiency that rippled throughout the entire organization. Washington found himself personally intervening in matters that should have been handled by junior officers, from settling disputes over camp sanitation to resolving conflicts between sentries and visiting dignitaries. Supply problems plagued every aspect of Army operations, with food shortages becoming particularly acute as summer progressed. Local farmers, initially enthusiastic about supporting the cause, grew increasingly reluctant to accept continental currency of dubious value in exchange for their crops and livestock. The absence of a reliable commissary system meant that some units feasted while others went hungry, depending on the initiative and connections of their immediate commanders. Washington's correspondence from this period reveals his growing frustration with the Continental Congress's inability to provide adequate financial support for basic military necessities. By mid-July 1775, Washington had uncovered a crisis that threatened to end the siege before it truly began. The powder shortage was even more severe than initially reported, with some estimates indicating the Continental Army possessed fewer than 9 rounds per man. This devastating intelligence reached Washington through his adjutant general, Horatio Gates, who had conducted a careful inventory of all ammunition stores throughout the camp. The implications were staggering. If the British launched a determined assault, the Continental Army might exhaust its ammunition within minutes of serious fighting. The powder crisis forced Washington to maintain an elaborate deception that would have impressed the most accomplished theatrical performer. Daily firing exercises were curtailed to preserve ammunition, yet this reduction had to be explained in ways that wouldn't reveal the Army's desperate situation to British spies. Known to be operating within the American lines, artillery practice was limited to dry runs, with gunners going through loading procedures without actually firing their cannons. Even sentinel duty was affected, as guards were instructed to challenge intruders verbally rather than risk wasting precious gunpowder on warning shots. Emergency measures were implemented to address the ammunition shortage, including desperate appeals to other colonies for powder and the establishment of makeshift manufacturing facilities. Connecticut had promised to send additional supplies, but colonial roads were barely adequate for normal traffic, let alone military convoys carrying volatile substances. Pennsylvania's offer of assistance was generous, but geographically problematic, as transporting gunpowder across hundreds of miles of wilderness presented enormous logistical challenges. Benedict Arnold, the ambitious Connecticut merchant who had already distinguished himself in the capture of Fort Ticonderoga, proposed an audacious solution to the powder problem. Arnold suggested launching an expedition to capture British supply vessels, known to be carrying ammunition and other military stores. His plan involved using small boats to intercept these ships under cover of darkness, a risky venture that would require precise timing and considerable luck. Washington found Arnold's aggressive spirit refreshing after dealing with more cautious subordinates. though the Virginian commander remained skeptical about the feasibility of such operations. Until LIG. Gathering became a critical priority as Washington sought to understand British intentions and capabilities within Boston. The Continental Army's network of spies and informants was primitive, compared to professional intelligence services relying primarily on fishermen, merchants, and sympathetic civilians who could move freely between the lines. These sources provided conflicting reports about British troop strength, morale, and strategic planning, forcing Washington to make decisions based on incomplete and sometimes contradictory information. The siege itself presented unique challenges that tested Washington's understanding of military science. Unlike traditional European sieges, where attacking forces would gradually construct trenches and fortifications to approach enemy walls, the Continental Army lacked both the engineering expertise and heavy artillery necessary for such operations. Instead, the Americans were forced to maintain a loose blockade that prevented British forces from foraging in the surrounding countryside. While hoping that shortages would eventually force their surrender, British naval superiority complicated every aspect of the siege, as Royal Navy ships could deliver supplies and reinforcements directly to Boston Harbor. Whenever weather permitted, Washington's forces could only watch helplessly as British vessels sailed past their positions, occasionally exchanging ineffective long-range artillery fire that did little damage to either side. The sight of enemy ships moving freely through waters that should have been controlled by the besieging army served as a constant reminder of the Continental Army's limitations and the enormous challenges facing the colonial cause. August 1775 brought both sweltering heat and mounting pressure, as Washington struggled to transform his volunteer army into a professional fighting force, capable of sustaining operations against experienced British regulars. The fortifications around Boston remained inadequate despite weeks of labor, with many positions offering little more than psychological comfort to their defenders. Earth-moving tools were in short supply, forcing soldiers to use everything from farming implements to their bare hands in constructing defensive works that would have to withstand British artillery bombardment. The arrival of Henry Knox in late August provided Washington with exactly the kind of energetic, capable subordinate he desperately needed. The 25-year-old Boston bookseller had fled the city when fighting erupted, but his extensive reading on military subjects and natural leadership abilities quickly impressed the commander-in-chief. Knox's proposal to retrieve the artillery captured at Fort Ticonderoga seemed impossibly ambitious, involving the transport of dozens of heavy cannons across hundreds of miles of wilderness. During the approaching winter months, Knox's expedition to Ticonderoga represented more than just a desperate attempt to acquire heavy artillery. It symbolized the kind of bold, innovative thinking that would be necessary for the colonial cause to succeed. Traditional military wisdom suggested that moving siege guns across such distances was impractical, if not impossible, particularly during winter when roads became impassable and rivers froze solid. Yet Knox argued that these same conditions might actually work in their favor, with frozen rivers providing natural highways for heavy sleds carrying artillery pieces. The Continental Congress had finally begun to address some of the Army's most pressing needs, authorizing the expenditure of funds for uniforms, equipment, and medical supplies. However, the gap between congressional authorization and actual delivery remained enormous, with corruption, inefficiency, and simple distance creating seemingly insurmountable obstacles. Washington's correspondence during this period reveals his growing frustration with politicians who made grand promises, but failed to understand the practical realities of military logistics. Training programs were established to address the Army's lack of military experience, though these efforts met with mixed success. European-style drill procedures seemed alien and unnecessary to men accustomed to the more flexible tactics of frontier warfare. Many soldiers questioned the value of marching in formation when they had already proven their effectiveness as individual marksmen during the fighting at Lexington, Concord, and Bunker Hill. Washington recognized the validity of some of these concerns while understanding that discipline formations would be essential for any sustained military campaign. Medical care emerged as another critical area requiring immediate attention, as disease posed a greater threat to the Continental Army than British bullets. Camp sanitation was primitive at best, with human waste disposal and food preparation practices that would have horrified any experienced military surgeon. Dr. Benjamin Church, The Army's chief medical officer implemented basic hygiene protocols, though his efforts were hampered by the soldiers' resistance to what they viewed as unnecessary interference in their personal habits. The question of enlistments loomed ever larger as summer gave way to fall, with many militia units considering their obligations fulfilled once their harvest seasons began. Washington faced the prospect of losing thousands of experienced soldiers. Just as the siege was beginning to show signs of success, British foraging parties were finding it increasingly difficult to obtain fresh provisions from the surrounding countryside, suggesting that the blockade was having its intended effect. Yet maintaining this pressure would require keeping substantial forces in the field throughout the winter months, a commitment that many New England farmers were reluctant to make. Communication with other colonial commanders remained problematic, as the Continental Army's rudimentary postal system was inadequate for coordinating military operations across vast distances. Reports from other theaters of war arrived weeks after the events they described, making it impossible for Washington to understand how his siege of Boston fit into the broader strategic picture. The approach of winter in 1775 brought new urgency to Washington's efforts to create a truly effective military force. From the collection of militia units surrounding Boston, October's crisp air carried the promise of harsh weather to come, and the Continental Army was woefully unprepared for a winter campaign. Many soldiers lacked adequate clothing for cold weather operations, while others had never experienced the kind of prolonged military service that would be required to maintain the siege through the harsh New England winter months. Henry Knox's departure for Fort Ticonderoga in November represented one of the war's most audacious logistical undertakings, though few observers at the time understood the full magnitude of what the young artillery officer was attempting. Knox's noble train of artillery, as it would later be called, consisted of 59 cannons, mortars, and howitzers weighing more than 120,000 pounds in total. The prospect of transporting this massive collection of weapons across 300 miles of wilderness during winter seemed so unlikely that even Washington had moments of doubt about the expedition's chances of success. The Continental Army's winter quarters began to take shape throughout the camps surrounding Boston, though these preparations revealed the desperate poverty of resources available to colonial forces. Barracks construction proceeded slowly due to shortages of lumber, nails, and other basic building materials that would have been readily available during peacetime. Many soldiers were forced to construct crude shelters from whatever materials they could scavenge, creating a patchwork of huts, tents, and lintos that offered minimal protection from the elements. Recruitment efforts for the new Continental Army met with limited success, as Washington attempted to replace short-term militia enlistments with longer commitments. The prospect of serving for an entire year seemed unreasonable to many New England farmers, who had originally viewed their military service as a temporary response to British aggression. Financial incentives were limited by the Continental Congress's reluctance to authorize adequate funding, while the questionable value of continental currency made monetary inducements less attractive than they might have been in peacetime. Intelligence reports from within Boston suggested that British morale was beginning to suffer under the effects of the prolonged siege. General Gage had been recalled to London and replaced by William Howe, a more aggressive commander who was reportedly considering offensive operations to break the American blockade. These reports, while encouraging, also raised concerns about the Continental Army's ability to withstand a determined British assault, particularly given the ongoing shortage of gunpowder and other essential military supplies. The Val of winter weather in December brought the siege to a virtual standstill, with both sides focusing primarily on survival rather than military operations. Snow and ice made movement difficult, while shortened daylight hours limited the time available for construction and training activities. British ships continued to arrive at Boston Harbor with supplies and reinforcements, though the frequency of these visits decreased as winter storms made navigation increasingly hazardous. Disease became an even more serious threat as soldiers crowded into inadequate shelters with poor ventilation and primitive sanitation facilities. Smallpox, typhus, and dysentery spread rapidly through the camps, killing more Continental soldiers than British bullets had managed to claim. Washington's decision to implement inoculation programs was controversial, as many soldiers feared the procedure more than they feared the disease itself. The commander-in-chief's willingness to undergo inoculation himself helped convince some skeptics though resistance remained strong among troops who viewed the practice as unnatural and dangerous. Training continued throughout the winter months, despite the challenging conditions, with Washington insisting that discipline and military proficiency could not be allowed to deteriorate during the inactive season. Baron Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben had not yet arrived to implement his famous drill manual, but other European officers provided instruction in basic military procedures that would prove invaluable once active operations resumed. The sight of Continental soldiers practicing formations in the snow became a common one throughout the camps, as men who had initially resisted military discipline gradually began to understand its importance. January 1776 marked a turning point in both the siege and Washington's confidence in his ability to lead the Continental Army to victory. Henry Knox's return from Fort Ticonderoga with his noble train of artillery seemed like a miracle to soldiers who had grown accustomed to disappointment and delay. The young colonel had accomplished what many military experts considered impossible, transporting 59 pieces of artillery across frozen rivers, through dense forests, and over mountain passes that challenged even experienced teamsters and their oxen. The successful completion of Knox's expedition provided Washington with the heavy artillery necessary to threaten British positions that had previously been considered impregnable. The captured cannons included 24-pounders capable of reaching targets throughout Boston Harbor, along with mortars that could drop explosive shells behind enemy fortifications. More importantly, the arrival of these weapons demonstrated that the Continental Army was capable of complex logistical operations that rivaled anything attempted by professional European armies. Planning for the occupation of Dorchester Heights began immediately upon Knox's return, as Washington recognized that this elevated position offered the key to controlling Boston Harbor and forcing a British evacuation. The Heights had remained unoccupied throughout the siege, due to the Continental Army's lack of artillery capable of defending such an exposed position. Now, with proper cannons in place, American forces could command both the harbor and the city itself, making the British position untenable. The technical challenges of fortifying Dorchester Heights during winter weather required innovative solutions that tested the ingenuity of Washington's engineering officers. Frozen ground made traditional earthwork construction impossible, forcing the Americans to develop alternative methods for creating defensive positions. Prefabricated wooden frames were constructed in the camps below, then carried up the heights, and filled with whatever materials could be found to create improvised fortifications. According to historical accounts from the Boston Public Library archives, the operation to occupy Dorchester Heights began on the night of March 4, 1776, exactly 1 year after the infamous Boston Massacre. The timing was both symbolic and practical, as the anniversary provided additional motivation for colonial forces, while the dark, moonless night offered maximum concealment for the massive logistical undertaking required to transport artillery and construction materials up the steep slopes. More than 2,000 Continental soldiers participated in the operation, working in carefully coordinated shifts to move cannons, ammunition, and fortification materials up the heights while maintaining absolute silence. The British, despite having sentries posted throughout Boston, remained completely unaware of the activity taking place less than a mile from their main positions. The success of this deception demonstrated how much the Continental Army had improved in terms of discipline and tactical sophistication since Washington's arrival 8 months earlier. By dawn on March 5th, American artillery was in position to dominate Boston Harbor, with cannons pointing down at British ships that had previously operated with impunity. The sight of Continental fortifications bristling with heavy artillery came as a complete shock to British commanders, who had assumed that such positions were impossible to establish during winter weather. General Howe reportedly exclaimed that the Americans had accomplished more in a single night than his own forces could have managed in months of effort. The British response was swift but ineffective, as attempts to dislodge American forces from Dorchester Heights met with disaster. Artillery bombardments for British positions in Boston fell short of their targets, while naval gunfire from ships in the harbor proved equally ineffective against the elevated American positions. A planned amphibious assault was abandoned when unfavorable winds made it impossible for British ships to provide adequate support for landing forces. The occupation of Dorchester Heights transformed the strategic situation around Boston overnight, forcing British commanders to confront the reality that their position had become untenable. General Howe's forces found themselves trapped between American artillery positions that could devastate the city and a hostile population that provided no support or intelligence to the occupying forces. The Royal Navy, despite its overwhelming superiority in open water, could not effectively operate in a harbor commanded by enemy artillery positions. On the surrounding heights, negotiations for a British evacuation began almost immediately, though these discussions were conducted through intermediaries rather than direct communication between the opposing commanders. Washington's position was simple. British forces could depart peacefully provided they did not destroy the city or harm civilian populations during their withdrawal. Howe, recognizing that continued resistance would result in massive casualties for no strategic gain, agreed to these terms while maintaining the fiction that he was conducting a strategic redeployment rather than acknowledging defeat. The evacuation of Boston began on March 17, 1776, a date that would be remembered as Evacuation Day throughout New England. British forces loaded their equipment, supplies, and approximately 1,000 Loyalist civilians onto more than 100 ships, anchored in Boston Harbor, the site of the mighty British Empire retreating before a colonial army that had barely existed 9 months earlier sent shock waves throughout the Atlantic world and demonstrated that American independence was not merely a distant dream, but an achievable reality. Washington's conduct during the evacuation demonstrated the strategic wisdom that would characterize his leadership throughout the Revolutionary War. Rather than attempting to harass British forces during their withdrawal, he allowed them to depart unmolested, recognizing that his primary objective was the liberation of Boston rather than the destruction of enemy forces. This restraint prevented unnecessary bloodshed while maintaining the moral authority that was essential for the colonial cause's continued success. The entry of Continental forces into Boston revealed the extent to which British occupation had affected the city's civilian population. Food shortages had been severe during the final months of the siege, with many families surviving on minimal rations while British forces consumed available supplies. Property damage was extensive, as occupying troops had dismantled buildings for firewood and converted churches and other public buildings into military facilities. The psychological impact of liberation was enormous, as residents who had endured months of military occupation finally regained control of their community. The strategic implications of the British evacuation extended far beyond Boston itself, as the Continental Army's success encouraged other colonies to commit more fully to the independence movement. News of Washington's victory spread rapidly throughout the colonies and across the Atlantic to European capitals, where potential allies began to reconsider their assessment of American military capabilities. The French government, in particular, took notice of the colonial victory and began to explore possibilities for supporting the American cause against their traditional British enemies. Washington's transformation from Virginia planter to successful military commander during the siege of Boston established his reputation as a leader capable of achieving victory against overwhelming odds. The Continental Army that marched out of Boston in March 1776 bore little resemblance to the collection of militia units that had assembled there 10 months earlier. Discipline, training, and shared hardship had forged these men into a professional fighting force capable of challenging the world's most powerful military establishment. The siege of Boston had ended, but the war for American independence was just beginning. Washington understood that future challenges would be even greater than those he had already overcome, as British forces would return with larger armies and more aggressive strategies. Yet the victory at Boston had proven that colonial forces could succeed against professional European armies when properly led and equipped. The foundation had been laid for a new nation, built on the courage and determination of ordinary citizens who had chosen to risk everything for the cause of freedom. The young Continental Army would face many more trials in the years ahead, but the triumph at Boston had demonstrated that American independence was not merely possible, but inevitable, given sufficient resolve and sacrifice from those willing to fight for their liberty.